Okay, I got different headphones. Um, my headphones were dying. Um, okay, so this is a bigger thing you should think about with movies. Is some people, one of the things movies often do is there's two characters, and one character thinks one thing, and another character thinks the other thing. And in the end, they fight, and one of them dies. And then you go, oh, I see. The person that made the movie obviously agrees with the person that won because they wrote it so that he wins. And the person who died, they were wrong. It's not always that clear. One of the screwed up things about Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's so interesting and complicated, is that, like, Macbeth's obviously a bad person, but I kind of admire him anyway. He's such a badass. He's so crazy. He never stops. He just fights and fights and fights and fights and fights, and he doesn't give up. And even though he's murdering children and being terrible, I like how intense he is. Now, he dies, but that's part of what I like about him, is that he's so intense. He just fights all the way up until the moment of his death. Coriolanus, too. Obviously, there's a lot of bad things about Coriolanus, but I kind of admire the fact that he dies almost makes it better. I don't think I would want Coriolanus to just live forever as an old man. I don't need that. Romeo and Juliet, too. But it's worth thinking about when you're thinking about movies. Because one thing you can write about when you're writing your papers is to compare the death of one character to the death of another character, and then talk about what do you think the author thinks about that death. And I think in a fucked up way, there's a reason why the audience can admire Macbeth. Not in spite of the fact that he dies, but because of it. He's so committed to his path. Coriolanus, too. I think that, like, we like Coriolanus, and I almost like the fact that he dies in the process. It's almost part of what I admire in him. Romeo and Juliet, they love so intensely, and the fact that they die still young, still beautiful, still intensely in love is part of what makes them like saints. These kind of saints of love, these very intense sort of creatures. So, okay. I'm going to start a scene now that I probably will not have time to properly finish, but it's the beginning of Act 3 in Romeo and Juliet, and it's a crucial scene. Romeo and Juliet are now secretly married. And Act 3 is really where things start to go very wrong. It's the scene where Mercutio dies. It's a pretty important scene, I think, to look at carefully. It's one of those real intense moments, like Lady Macbeth and Macbeth discussing whether or not they should kill Duncan. It's a sort of very important bit. So let's take a look at it. One of the problems looking at this scene is Mercutio. I love Mercutio, but Mercutio makes a lot of jokes. You notice I teach a lot of tragedies. I find the tragedies are easier to teach because everybody understands bloodshed and violence and death. But when characters come on and they're comedians, they're often making jokes that only made sense 400 years ago and need piles of footnotes. I have this edition of Shakespeare that has sort of, Shakespeare at the top and the footnotes at the bottom. And every time Mercutio comes on screen, there's like 5 times as many footnotes. So it's like the bottom is footnotes, but then when Mercutio shows up, like half the page is footnotes because all of his jokes require complicated footnotes. So I find him a little bit annoying to teach, even though I like his character. But let's take a look at some of Mercutio's stuff. So this is the beginning of Act 3. We're on page 14. Romeo and Juliet are secretly married. Benvolio is Romeo's best friend, and Mercutio and Benvolio are both Romeo's friends. I pray thee, good Mercutio, let's retire. Let's go inside. The day is hot, and the Capels are abroad. That's the Capulets, Juliet's family. And if we meet, we shall not scape a brawl. We're going to get in a fight. For now, these hot days is the mad blood stirring. And Mercutio says, thou art like one of those fellows that when he enters the confines of a tavern, claps me his sword upon the table and says, God send me no need of thee, and by operation of the second cup draws him on the drawer when indeed there is no need. Benvolio says, am I like such a fellow? So Mercutio says, you're like one of those people that doesn't want to fight, and then as soon as you have one drop of alcohol, you're excited to fight. Benvolio, by the way, very humorously says, am I such a fellow? Mercutio says, come, thou art as hot a jack in thy mood as any in Italy, and as soon to be moody, and as soon moody to be moved. Meaning, like, you're emotional, you get in fights quickly, and you say you're not going to fight, but you always do. Mercutio is describing himself here. I don't think Benvolio is like that. Benvolio, in the first scene of the play, when everybody's fighting, Benvolio tried to calm things down. It's Mercutio is the one who picks all the fights, and he's like, dude, you always pick fights. Like, you're the one who's picking all the fights with everybody. Mercutio's nuts. And so he gives a whole speech here. Nay, and there were two such, we should have none shortly, for one would kill the other. Meaning if there was more than one of you, you'd kill each other because you love fighting. It's Mercutio, he loves fighting. Why, thou wilt quarrel with a man that hath more hair or less hair in his beard than thou hast. Thou wilt quarrel with a man for cracking nuts, having no other reason but because thou hast hazel eyes. What eye but such an eye would spy out such a quarrel? Thy head is as full of quarrels as an egg is full of meat, and yet thy head hath been beaten as addle as an egg for quarreling. Thou hast quarrelled with a man for coughing in the street, because he hath wakened thy dog that hath lain asleep in the sun. Didst thou not fall out with a tailor for wearing his new doublet before Easter, with another for tying his new shoes with old ribbon, and yet thou wilt tutor me from quarreling? So he says, basically, it's a list of things, Mercutio. Now, you know Mercutio loves to talk. I remember the Queen Mab speech. He has a gigantic speech. So here Mercutio is just like listing. You love to get in fights. You'll fight with a guy because he wore the wrong color shirt. You'll fight with a guy because he coughed and woke up your dog. None of this is true, by the way. I think this is very much true of Mercutio's like that, but I don't really think Benvolio's like that. Mercutio is describing himself. And were I apt so quarrel as thou art, any man should buy the simple fee of my life for an hour and a quarter. The fee simple, oh simple. Here comes the Capulets, and Mercutio says, I care not. See, because he wants to get in a fight. Now, Tybalt shows up. Now, Tybalt is Juliet's cousin. She's a family member of Juliet's. And Tybalt, John Leguizamo plays him in the movie, and he's fucking rad in that movie. He loves fighting. One of the things you got to the thing about Tybalt that's important to know, Tybalt loves to fight. Now, Mercutio enjoys fighting. But Tybalt is like a professional fighter. And in professional, I mean that he's like read books about fancy sword fighting. It's not so much that he's an expert fighter. I think Mercutio and Tybalt are very similar. They're both very good. But Mercutio will just, fight to win. Tybalt wants to fight in like a fancy way. He wants to look cool when he fights. He has style. That's the thing about Tybalt. A lot of these guys, all these guys are fighting each other, but Tybalt has he has fancy sword moves that he learned from fancy sword books, and he went to fancy sword school. He's sort of like a dancer. Tybalt has fancy moves, and so Mercutio makes fun of Tybalt. Tybalt's very deadly, but he's also, because he's so fancy about it, Mercutio really thinks this is funny, and so Mercutio harasses Tybalt about it. So Tybalt shows up, and Tybalt says, follow me close, for I will speak to them. Gentlemen, good evening, a word with one of you. Mercutio says, make it but one word with one of us? Couple it with something. Make it a word and a blow. And in the movie, it suggests blowjob, but here blow means don't just talk. Don't you want to fight? You shall find me apt enough to that, sir, and you will give me occasion, meaning give me a good reason to fight, and I'll fight you. Could you not take some occasion without giving? Just harassing him. Mercutio, thou consortest with Romeo. Tybalt is mad because Romeo showed up at his family party. Remember, that's where he met Juliet. But he went in disguise to that party because, of course, he can't just go there normally because his family and their family are at war with each other, so he went in disguise. But Tybalt saw through the disguise and recognized it was Romeo, and he's offended. How dare you come to my house when your family is the enemy of my family, and now I have to fight you in a duel, a fancy duel. So Tybalt has shown up to fight Romeo. Romeo's not there. He sees Mercutio, and he says, Romeo's a bad guy, and you're consorting with him. You're friendly with Romeo. But consorting has all kinds of complicated meanings, including maybe ones that involve being gay. And so Mercutio sort of takes offense and wants to get in a fight. Consort? What, dost thou make us minstrels? Consort can also mean to play an instrument. Thou dost make minstrels of us, to hear us not, but discords. Here's my fiddlestick. That shall make you dance. His fiddlestick is his sword. Fiddlestick is supposed to be something to play music with, because consort can also mean to play music. Again, Mercutio has a lot of complicated jokes here. Benvolio tries to calm everybody down. We talk here in the public haunt of men. Either withdraw to some private place or coldly reason of your grievances, or else depart. Here all eyes gaze on us. See, Benvolio's not what Mercutio said. Benvolio loves to get in fights, but here you can see Benvolio trying to calm the situation down. And that's going to be a key thing that's going to happen in this scene, is these families are fighting, and Romeo, like Benvolio, is going to try to calm things down. It's not going to work. We're not going to finish the scene today, but I'll do one more video, and then we'll pick it up later.